All right, 7:30. Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. It's day 4241 of us being in business. We are honored to welcome back DeWitt Clinton, this time virtually, for his new book, By a Lake Near a Moon, Fishing with the Chinese Masters. He is the author of numerous books and chapbooks. His work has appeared in publications including Divine Inspiration, The Life of Jesus in World Poetry, and Sha, an Asian Literary Journal. Tonight, we are honored to have as his conversation partner, Sylvia Cavanaugh, the English language editor for Poetry Hall, Chinese and English Bilingual Journal, and she is also the author of Icarus, Anthropology of Addiction. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to Boswell for their support of poetry and for hosting this conversation series and their support of local authors. Tonight, we're here to celebrate and explore DeWitt Clinton's latest book, By a Lake Near a Moon, Fishing with the Chinese Masters. I first became aware of DeWitt's poetry through Verse Virtual, an online community of poets, where he's been a regular contributor. I was always impressed with the way DeWitt could be very specific in his details and images, all the while giving the impression somehow that these things are sometimes experienced at a distance or in another life. DeWitt navigates time, traversing the present and the past deftly as his poems progress from line to line. DeWitt's poetry was also featured in the 5th issue of Poetry Hall, a Chinese and English bilingual journal, with 3 adaptations of poems by the classical Chinese poet Lu Yu. Which brings us to DeWitt's new book, inspired by Kenneth Rexroth's collection of translation poems, 100 Poems from the Chinese. DeWitt's poems are after poems that rework classical Chinese themes placed within a contemporary Milwaukee setting. So DeWitt, I'd like you to start by reading 3 or 4 poems so that listeners can get a feel for the flavor of your new book.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. If you were in my room, it would be a little crowded. Anyway, I wanted to give some thank yous before we get started, especially to Krosia Jopek, who was the first editor who said she wanted to publish the book, and her colleague Meg Harris. But Michael Dickel, who is living in Jerusalem, is the publisher of Israel's Press. I also wanted to thank all the editors from different parts of the world who showed an interest in the poems, and especially to Boswell Books. It's nice to be coming back to a second reading. And to the Milwaukee Yoga Center for helping promote this, and to the Lake Effect program on WUWM, and Shepherd Express put together a wonderful preview. And I want to do a shout out to Meredith Watts, whose photograph doesn't resemble me at all, but more like a piece of sculpture. People have been talking about it a lot. And Joan Thomason. Joan is my wife's older sister, no longer with us, but she studied Chinese brush painting in Virginia and also in China when she was teaching young kids English. And most of all, we want to thank Sylvia for putting up with me. And all of you, thank you for being here. To give you a sense of what this book is about, it's a bit like classical Chinese poets touring Milwaukee. If you can put that into your mind, that will help you a little bit to adjust to this. If you have your copy, I'm reading number 16. After a longer than usual swim and a shorter run than usual, I face overcast light and wonder why Du Fu wrote New Moon. So every title has the reference to the classical poet and the poem that I'm adapting. Facing the eastern night sky, the full moon was so full, we pressed our thumbs closer than ever before. It's never been this big before. It's like a big stage prop. I wanted to go there, but only as a trip. Coffee and scones in short supply with no daffodils, no early spring, only long dusty winters so far away in the Milky Way. Some of the poems are quite short. I tend to write long poems, so it was fun to be looking at something much shorter. This is from Su Tung Po. With tulip trees blooming all over our village by the lake, I opened Su Tung Po's The Purple Peach Tree. It's so hard to think of death around here, as everything in the ground is opening into full bloom, though our sweet old Bartlett tree has now been lathed into perfect bowls. We loved it more than anything else we'd ever want. First, a summer storm, then next year, quite the same. I don't think I've ever mourned a tree as much as our wild, untamed, white blossomed backyard Bartlett. The bees would take such leisurely baths in the fall, making such sweet drinking songs. And another one to give you a taste of, or a sense of the poems. This is by the way, I am not able to pronounce or read in Chinese letters. So I'm looking at a couple of notes I have for the pronunciation. But this is from Zhu Zi. After reading the morning news near the lake, I turned to Zhu Zi thoughts while reading. The 22-inch screen gleams back at who we are, reclined. It's a mirror of splendor, with dancers, murderers, chefs, and X-Files, all acting as special guests. We've even learned how to save their future in case we're not here now. Summer storms often change our little stage to black. So, Sylvia, those are sort of introductory poems. It's as if a word about Kenneth Rexroth. These are not precise Chinese translations, correct number of lines and words, but rather Kenneth Rexroth took the core Chinese translation and then wrote something else. And though they are referred to as the Chinese poets, he's really made them poems of the American 1970s. So his book, 100 Poems from the Chinese, is a classic example of poems in that free verse style of the 1970s. And I'm just so intrigued with his book. It was so refreshing after reading a whole different kind of poetry that I just started writing. Sylvia.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, and in fact, how it is that you came to choose this collection by Rexroth to respond to. And then I wanted to have you maybe read a couple poems by Rexroth and then your response, kind of a side by side.
Okay. In the world, there are maybe 100 or more titles of poems called 100 Poems From, in the name of the poet. And when I was working on a sabbatical at UW Whitewater, one of my projects was to look at all of the 100 poems in the world. And by the time I found the Chinese, they were so intriguing to me, and there were so many volumes. Must have been about a dozen books compared to one or two from a country. So I had also hoped to start collecting my own 100, but this was far more interesting. And so one of the pleasures of reading Kenneth Rexroth is that he has translated many Asian poets and put them into something like 100 poems from the Chinese. Actually, it's 114. Here is A lot of poems in this, so I have to find my place. Sorry about, here we go. This is a poet named Ouyang Hu. And he's writing a poem. This is Kenneth Rexroth's, an answer to Ting Wan Xian. The spring wind will never teach me on this distant frontier. It is the second month, and there are no flowers in the town or in the hills. Destructive snow breaks the branches where oranges should hang. Freezing wind and thunder drive the bamboo shoots back into the earth. All night, you can hear the sad cries of the wild geese. They make me think of my old home. I have been sick since the new year. The sight of flowers might cheer me up. I am no longer your guest among the flowers at Luoyang. But even the wildflowers, if they would only come, would be enough to make me happier. So, trading books now. Oh, by the way, you do not need to read every Kenneth Rexroth poem to understand what I've written. I hope the book sort of stands up on its own. Walking by the river, I wonder what the question was in Ouyang Hu's An Answer to Ting Yang Xin. We're threatened with snow flurries by the end of the night. The ground, almost green, can barely push the first crocuses and hyacinths up from our brown-white winter. Further south, the strawberries and oranges are nearly ruined by late freezes. Somewhere, the first spring winds will drop down and deliver cold, boiled ice. The neighbors keep their wolfhound out all night long. We won't even dream of sleep. The two of us wink in between the barks. Tomorrow, since it's spring, we'll buy some cut spring flowers just in case you might think of dropping by. If we could do anything, we'd probably have the robins in just to bring the spring inside. And here's another Kenneth Rexroth. I wouldn't call what Kenneth Rexroth has done as translations. He did have a translation team, but he's adapted the pure translation into something a little bit more easier to follow. Night Thoughts While Traveling by Du Fu. A light breeze rustles the reeds along the riverbanks. The mast of my lonely boat soars into the night. Stars blossom over the vast desert of waters. Moonlight flows on the surging river. My poems have made me famous, but I grow old, ill, and tired, blown hither and yon. I am like a gull, lost between heaven and earth. So, how does that develop into small winter objects fall from the sky, make us all cry. Inside, Du Fu, alone with brush, ink, paper, hears night noise, writes homecoming late at night. I know my home by heart, could almost find it without looking. The turns along Lake Drive, something I've done far too long. Often the house is dark. One room glows where you are. Then we make dinner, eat with pillows behind us. Soon the lights will be out, our eyes watching the dark inside. We're safe, we pretend, from murderers, rapists, men who would die to know where they could come murder us all night long. By the way, this book is dedicated to my wife, and because she has a nursing background with lots of interest in the body, She likes a lot of corner films, which just terrify me. So I'm scared to death, and she's looking at an open corpse on the corner's table, and that's how that develops. But that, Sylvia, is a little bit of how the poems from Kenneth Rexroth sort of become adapted into something from Milwaukee.
Thank you. It's really interesting to see the ways in which you work with and interpret Rexroth's translation of ancient Chinese poems. Elliot Weinberger, in writing about Rexroth, observed that among the things in Chinese poetry that directly appealed to Rexroth and later Gary Snyder and David Hinton was its celebration of wilderness. DeWitt, your book begins with the poem after reading Tu Fu's Banquet at the So family Manor, and right away you draw us into a vivid domestic scene with food, a Siamese cat, and time spent with your wife as the winter winds howl outside. One feels the enormous force of winter pressing in on the evening's domestic scene, leading perhaps inevitably to thoughts of mortality. These are themes that resonated in ancient China and remain fresh through the lens of your own poetic eye. So I'm going to read Banquet at the So family Manor as translated by Kenneth Rexroth, and then DeWitt, I would like you to follow with your adaptation of it, which is the opening poem in your book. So here is Banquet at the So family Manor. The windy forest is checkered by the light of the setting, waning moon. I tune the lute. Its strings are moist with dew. The brook flows in the darkness below the flower path. The thatched roof is crowned with constellations. As we write, the candles burn short. Our wits grow sharp as swords while the wine goes round. When the poem contest is ended, someone sings a song of the South, and I think of my little boat and long to be on my way.
By the way, Sylvia, there are a lot of drinking poems in this.
Yeah, right.
And one of the editors who I heard about was putting together a volume of poems about drinking. And I was so pleased that we could get a Du Fu poem in there. After reading Du Fu's Banquet at the Zhou family Manor. So this is an American version, more modern. Tonight we're having eggs again, but we found some plump, tiny tomatoes to add some color and, of course, some taste. The winds howl as we swirl the eggs. There is no brook by our house, only a frozen lake as big as a state. Tonight we might watch another episode of NCIS. I can almost say their lines before they say their lines. Then our room is dark. The Siamese will find a way to nestle between us. Tomorrow it will still be winter. I will go home soon.
Nice, thank you. Thank you, DeWitt. I also, another theme that comes through your collection is your experience as a triathlete. And I find it interesting the way you weave together your training as a triathlete with the natural setting of Milwaukee, especially the lake. In Wife Away on Holiday, I take a long morning run in snow showers along the lakefront, then sip coffee in the boiler room of a favorite coffee house and open Tu Fu's Loneliness. The poem first describes nature, as in gulls and geese keep company nearby. Few try solo flights as the snow, first dusting, now comes down in big, thick flakes. Then you turn from the birds to your own experience with the winter, but mirroring the birds in I almost took flight after a patch of ice. So could you please talk a little bit about how your training as a triathlete, especially perhaps in winter, has informed your poetry, and then share a poem that touches on that?
That's challenging to answer. Sometimes I go to Milwaukee coffee houses after some jogging around the Lake Michigan, and then I open up Kenneth Rexroth. And sometimes it's more about that. And it's not so much trying to make each line or words from each line fit into something contemporary. It's more like, this was so inspiring. Let me see what I can do to create a reaction to that. It's more of that rather than finding, rather than saying, I've just finished running or jogging slowly 7 miles, and let me see how I can fit that in. It's more a sense of a trigger, as if your feelings are awakened to something after reading some of the poems. Here is Kenneth Rexroth. Spring day on West Lake. We have a lake too. The lovely spring breeze has come back to the Lake of the West. The spring waters are so clear and green they might be freshly painted. The clouds of perfume are sweeter than can be imagined. In the gentle east wind, the petals fall like grains of rice. The old military counselor, moved by the spring, is filled with troubled thoughts. His white hairs, like this poem, are a salute of autumn to spring. He offers the lake a cup of wine. He thinks of his comrades on the frontiers of heaven, 10,000 miles away. The spring moves the heart of all men alike. Snow melts from the passes. The mountains turn green. Flowers cover the riverbanks. Under the full moon of April, young men welcome the spring with wine and love. But me, once more greeting the spring, my head is white. I am in a strange land in the midst of people whose ways are not mine. The soft east wind is the only familiar thing from the old days. After running a half marathon along the South Lake shore, I rest all afternoon with Ouyang Hu's spring day on West Lake. Today is perfect with spring breezes, no ice, no sleet, no gale winds, too soon for sailboats. The lake's blue, the sky's blue appears almost painted palettes. Even the clouds don't threaten us. Everyone's still groggy before the early start, which some don't even know has just begun. Some fall before we start. Though old, I'm still spring despite the autumn deep inside with my old tired thighs, old shoes, old shirt, even gloves on these old hands. But I surprise us all with strides so long right from the start, I may do this in record time. It's spring, the start of racing season. We're so impatient just to race. No need to dodge ice patches as green now shoots up on the sandy path. It's spring racing with young men, young women running behind each other. But me, my head's still into spring, despite the fact my cap's all white. I barely know a soul. Few would even stop to even say hello. Sprinting toward a record best this spring may just help keep old days away.
Oh, thank you.
That's a little connection between finding the sadness in the classical Chinese poem and trying to bring some of that into the poem as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Good, thank you. Your poems certainly have helped expand my appreciation of Chinese poetic themes. In the poem, Remembering High Beams on Night Commutes, I read Tu Fu's Night Thoughts While Traveling. You incorporate Chinese themes such as travel and the moon, as in, I sometimes crane my neck so the moon can shine all yellowy into my old blue eyes. And later, I dread the high beams reflecting in the deer's eyes, tiny moons I don't want to crash into. Then the unexpected turn to the themes of the poet's life and war to conclude this tightly constructed poem. Could you read that poem for us, DeWitt?
I could, but my dear college friend is with us here, and his name is Larry Parrish. I'm going to give a wave to Larry Parrish, and you can wave to him also. We were college roommates and classmates. And when we were both in Vietnam, Larry was a mile or two away observing a overrun fire base. And knowing that I was there because he received the letter, was calling me to see if I was alive. So there's that. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're both here, Larry. The poem also has a quotation from Du Fu. My poems have not made me famous. And there's another reference to NVA sappers, North Vietnamese Army soldiers. So we were overrun in June of '69. And that means that a lot of American soldiers died and a lot of NVA soldiers died. And I have no explanation for why I'm here, none, just lucky. Remembering high beams on night commutes, I read Du Fu's Night Thoughts while traveling. At night, traveling at high speeds, I sometimes crane my neck so the moon can shine all yellowy into my old blue eyes. Moon risings are breathtaking, a relief after moving papers and students around all day. In the fall, I dread the high beams reflecting in deer's eyes, tiny moons I don't want to crash into. My poems have not made me famous, Du Fu writes, but without them, I might as well have died when NVA sappers overran our outpost, the night lit with tracer rounds, a Russian flamethrower.
Yeah, that's a really powerful poem. It's yeah, definitely one of the standouts for me in that collection. Thank you for reading that. Another theme that recurs a lot in this collection is the theme of love and the long-lasting relationship of your marriage. But the relationship is always presented as being, completely intertwined with descriptions of everyday life. So if you could please read, "Jubilant after watching the sun rise out of the big blue lake, I'm now despondent after reading Ye Yao Chen's On the Death of His Wife," and "Sitting with my dear wife near the cold blue lake, I open Mi Yao Chen's In Broad Daylight, I Dream of My Dead Wife." And then if you could discuss the way you think about using images from everyday life in writing about your marriage.
Well, to answer that last question, Sylvia, the classical Chinese poets write so much about their relationships with people in their family, close friends, and it sort of turns that way when I began to sort of write a response. These are not depressing poems, but they sound like they might be.
Yeah, right.
So this first poem is Miao Jin on the death of his wife. So the title is "Jubilant after watching the sun rise out of the big blue lake. I'm now despondent after reading Miao Jin's On the Death of His Wife. For our 40th, my wife wants to see Paris. On our 35th, we held hands in the Uffizi and licked gelato. Both of us now sport white hair, though she's tinted red and I'm quite bald. We still love Cats and Dogs, the movie. So I'd never see it if she dies, for fear I'd die of despair. We just saw it a couple of nights ago. It was great fun. So the next poem in Kenneth Rexroth's poem continues with this theme of a dead wife. I can't explain why. Sitting with my dear wife near the cold blue lake, I open Mi Yao Chen's In Broad Daylight, I Dream of My Dead Wife. how much time do we really have with each other? Most days we are near each other. Occasionally we fly around the world without the other. Mostly we're in each other's arms. After dreaming, I look up and there you are, dreaming. Sometimes, though, we kiss not knowing what evening brings. What would we do when we're dead? So one of the things that I find fascinating about these translations by Kenneth Rexroth is how a line or an image just comes out of nowhere.
Mhm.
And I think in some ways it's Kenneth Rexroth's interest in leaping poetry of the 1970s. And I think one critic we've been reading the last week or so mentioned that it's a collection like this and other classical Chinese poets that moved so many poets who were writing in the 1970s.
Mhm.
Anyway, those are the two.
Okay, thank you. Throughout the book, you demonstrate the ability to work with Kenneth Rexroth's translations in an improvisational style. And the cumulative effect of these poems is to see the tightly interwoven connection between the poet as a writer and the poet as a human being. You embrace the beauty of the natural world and also do not shy away from troubling thoughts. And sometimes even ancient China peeks her head around the corner. As in after swimming in an indoor lake on the first day of June, I wonder underwater about Li Chin Chow's Alone in the Night. Would you please read that poem for us?
Just to be clear, when my head is in the water, I'm not really thinking about that.
Okay.
I'm trying not to take in water. On Memorial Day, every gardener gathers lots of flats of flowers and vegetables to go quickly into small patches of black earth. Knees dropping to pull weeds, I join neighbors in our late spring rites. Inside, my poems still need help from an old drunk who knows better than I how to break those lines. Do my poems ever change who you still are? Or do you just smile and nod sometimes? By early night, I'm fast under covers, scared of even more murderers who will come to murder us, lying in a grave all night long. Maybe I'll dream of women carrying lanterns for their lovers. So to speak about this poem a bit, sometimes there's a word or just an image or just an overwhelming feeling or an intuition or just, my, that was wonderful. Let me take a note on that. And a poem sort of develops. Many of the poems have the same number of lines and the same number of syllables per line. So I didn't want to wander off completely and write without any kind of form that allows me to sort of stay close to the translations. But there were lots of variations, but that was one.
Yeah, I really love the ending, that little surprise of the Chinese woman with the lantern, you know.
Especially
Very,
if the other person's in the coffin.
right. You know, one thing that is really striking is that you wrote these poems from a variety of locations, and we know that from the titles. But this variety of location, I feel, really adds a lot of flavor to the entire collection. Could you discuss that process you have of writing in such a variety of locations?
Okay. In the back of Kenneth Rexroth's book are lots of notes, which I found fascinating. He's writing about Du Fu. And in many ways, what he writes about Du Fu and his interest in adapting these poems to a modern vernacular is the same as I have. I have chosen only those poems in here, whose appeal is simple and direct with a minimum of allusion to past literature or contemporary politics. In other words, poems that speak to me of situations in life like my own. I have thought of my translations as, finally, expressions of myself. I find that very interesting. I think in many ways, responding to these poems, all of the translations by Kenneth Rexroth are grounded in some place.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the locations are, I have no idea where they are. But I think that there's always something inside those poems that's evocative, that triggers something new. And in some ways, sort of following Ezra Pound's dictum about writing poetry, make it new, I was so moved by how contemporary Kenneth Rexroth's poems were of 9th to 13th century Chinese poets,
Mm-hmm.
that I also wished to make Rexroth's poems new by putting them in a new location. So again, it's something like classical Chinese poets on tour in the Midwest and finding Milwaukee.
And it does seem like in a lot of those old poems, the poets are traveling around a lot.
Yes.
You know, that seems to be a really big theme is the poet as a traveler.
On foot.
Yeah. So the way you set your poems in these different locations and writing in different locations seems to really capture that spirit of the poet wanderer.
Some are driving home from what used to be employment. Some are cycling north of Milwaukee. Some are swimming in Wisconsin lakes. There are some great jogging paths around east side Milwaukee. So a lot of those experiences, having just completed them or having just experienced them, go into the making of responding to the classical poems.
Yeah, it seems as though when you write, there's a real, almost like physicality to your experience of writing. It might be after running or after swimming or, being out in different landscapes, it seems as though there's something like physical for you involved in the writing.
Well, sometimes I'm just being frightened to death by watching another autopsy. So it's not always moving someplace.
Right. Yeah. What have been your greatest influences as a poet?
In a previous book published by Kelsey Press, I wrote a poem, kind of a response to Elizabeth Bishop, who is a poet who I've taken a great interest in. I enjoy her work so much because she took so long to develop one poem, and she wrote just a few poems in her lifetime. A favorite poem is The Moose. For some readers, that poem is like 5 pages too long, but I enjoyed it immensely. I also remember her poem In the Waiting Room, remembering as a child the sounds going on as the dentist takes care of a cavity in the next room of her Aunt Consuelo. So I had just come home from taking my wife to an ear, nose, and throat doctor who was trying to help her with her dry sinuses. And I heard all those sounds. So I used Elizabeth Bishop's In the Waiting Room as a guide and tried to find images of what I just experienced in the waiting room. Lots of magazines, sitcoms, not sitcoms, soap operas going on at the same time, hearing voices, and it was such a treat. And I think in many ways, that process of writing adaptations has a lot to do with being so inspired by art or history or historical events. I remember when I was a long time ago in Bowling Green, Ohio, in graduate school, a professor suggested I read a translation of the Shalom Balam of Shumael, which is a retelling of the stories of the Maya and the conquistadors. I was so drawn to that I created a long poem in response to having read the Shalom Balam of Shumael. And I think that probably started a long interest in adaptations or writing after poems or improvisations. I think I'm drawn to paintings, not all of them. I love art museums. And sometimes there's a painting that is simply so wonderful, trying to do something with it. So it could be classical paintings, could be contemporary paintings. I've done that. I've also, one recent example is having visited Auschwitz death camp in Poland on a tour with college students from Milwaukee. I returned home because one of my sabbatical projects, an earlier sabbatical, was to develop a course, Literature of the Holocaust. But I had also been reading the Tao De Ching. So this particular poem, reading the Tao De Ching at Auschwitz, as a title seems impossible. But I found these phrases from the Tao De Ching that seemed to fit perfectly with what had happened at Auschwitz. So in some ways, I'm trying to sort of juxtapose incongruous themes or subjects or something like that, and try to make something new out of the two who have never been put together again like that. That's something of an expression.
Yes. Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Yes.
To explain it.
Yeah, thank you. Are you working on another book?
I am, and it's not an adaptation of anything. It's a new collection. I have a small press publisher, may come out in early 22 or late 21. And they are, well, actually there were some myth poems I developed in them, some Chinese myths. But for the most part, they are very experiential. I can be the objective poet looking out at the world, and I can also respond to what's happening in my little world as well. So one evening we were going to dinner with friends, and we had just gotten into the car door was opening, and a neighbor friend cycled by, and we waved and said hello, and she kept cycling by. She was in her 80s, I think, on her bike. And she raised her hand. "Hello there," in a trembling voice. And I was just struck by that experience. So that's the title poem. They are, some of them are rants, R-A-N-T-S, angry poems, which are quite different from these poems.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
Good, good. Well, we look forward to seeing that collection. Yes, good. Would you like to conclude with a poem and then tell us why you're choosing that poem?
Well, I like all of them. But here is one by Lu Yu. After an early morning run along the lakeside, I rest old legs with Lu Yu. I walk out into the country at night. Here is what Kenneth Rexroth did with Lu Yu's translation. The moon is so high it is almost in the Great Bear. I walk out of the city along the road to the west. The damp wind ruffles my coat. Dewy grass soaks my sandals. Fishermen are singing on the distant river. Foxfires dance on the ruined tombs. A chill wind rises and fills me with melancholy. I try to think of words that will capture the uncanny solitude. I come home late. The night is half spent. I stand for a long while in the doorway. My young son is still up, reading. Suddenly he bursts out laughing, and all the sadness of the twilight of my life is gone. I seldom think of walking all night, that perhaps I could walk all the way to downtown, then by morning be on the border. At night, the trees would sway and make the saddest sounds. At night, singing travels further since we can't tell where the voices started from. By now, I don't know why I'm here, not home in bed with covers keeping murderers away. It's like this every time I'm driving home so late with only our moon to guide me all the way back home. My wife's still up with her insomnia. Then we're both in bed and the night stays right outside. Tomorrow we'll be so much older.
Mm-hmm.
There are other poems. Anyway.
Yeah, beautiful poem. We would be happy to have questions. DeWitt would be happy to answer any questions you may have. You can use the chat function and type in any questions you may have.
Well, Sue Blaustein also likes the moose, so I would recommend maybe reading a few Elizabeth Bishop poems. They're wonderful. Someone from New York writes, beautiful poems about daily life and long love, tears, sighs, longing, memories, pain, sweetness. For my niece, who has seen a lot of these poems, she lives in New York.
Nice.
But I wonder, I don't think we can turn on all of your screens to audio. You've all been blocked. So I wonder what we should do, Sylvia. I'll read one more.
Good.
Miao Chin. On returning to the river's edge to find my wife's lost tooth. Oh, sorry. Again, Lu Yu. Nearing the longest day of the year, I pull weeds, plant a flat of flowers, then open Lu Yu's The Wild Flower Man. No one really notices the old woman who sells bunches of bok choy in the shade outside the indoor palace. All morning long, we never see who hoes and chops all day. They've been here since the war brought them across from old Laos. The marigolds and asters always sell before her leafy greens. The two of us wonder where they go when they're not behind what we love to smell. We've both been down on our knees as well, pulling all the weeds we just don't want to see in between what we planted that we hope will grill with just caught fish. Our good neighbor just can't stand the woofs woofs anymore, so we'll see squad cars pulling up late at night to check out what's not right with our doggy neighbor, who by now is smiling with a cold one.
Yes.
It's wonderful to be with you all.
Yes, it's well that someone says, please keep reading.
Okay. After a mile swim, I wonder about lake swims in June and remember the Blue River by Miao Jin. After the war, I wore fatigues day in and day out. We yacked and I wept way too much. We ferried all the animals to a new farm in Holland. For adventure, we once prayed all day in Prague. To see the aigrettes, we took a guide far up the river. For a moment, we eyebrowed each other, then wept. Some days these dreams vanish before I can ever see you over there. Still here, becoming better than ever. What I connect with is the longing for the spring, the isolation of winter, and the dread of cold and dark. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really weaves through all the poems and it has a cumulative effect. It's very powerful. But then the next one says, your poem about kissing your day wife goodnight reminds me of Rilke's poem that opens with, what will you do, God, when I die? Has your work been influenced by him?
Well, Walt, I haven't read enough of Rilke. So a little bit. I'm responding more to the Chinese classical poets than other poets I probably should be reading as well. But back to Jade Mueller's question, the 114 poems are very seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
And you could look at this collection as a collection about the seasons of Milwaukee.
Yes.
Because sometimes we're looking for fish to eat, and other times we're fishing out men and women who've jumped off of the bridges and don't come up for several months. So there's a kind of a wildness about the poems sometimes that are so unexpected and so surprising to me. One of the things about this book is I don't usually have surprises. I sort of know where I'm going with the poem. I have a sense of what I want to do, but the Chinese poets always just, they're not shocking. They're just quite surprising where something out of nowhere comes into their work.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, let's see.
Here's a request to read number 60.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't read that one because it was a bit longer. It's a whole page. I'm used to 10 or 20 page poems. On a mid-April afternoon, near the banks of the Milwaukee River, I read Sutong Po's The Red Cliff. Sadly, it's not the Potomac, so we don't expect to see our president float by, but we do fish out the dead who've dropped their lives from our higher jumping bridges. Of course, the other side is all Wisconsin, then a river too wide to walk across, then stinky hogs, and waving corn and waving wheat, snow-capped mountains, then white wineland, just before the few can sail to old Hong Kong. For many, this is heaven, as the dead are planted all the way. Long ago, we gathered on the banks to remember the wedding of two Wiccans, complete with song and brooms and ropes wrapped around their wrists for love. Only later did we learn about the rope that wrapped around our dear dead bride, who repeated what her mother also did with rope. We heard she may be resting in the East. Why do these poet friends vanish into ash and smoke? The younger ones will laugh their heads off when they see my hairless head, but I don't care a bit. Just pour that right up to the lip. while I watch one more moon rise out of what we call our muddy river. So we meaning faculty at UW Whitewater, lost two dear faculty members. And this is a reference to one of them who, to my surprise, someone called and said, our friend Angela has hung herself. Well, I've been disturbed about that for years. So that sort of came into this. There's another poem about Angela and her colleague. David writes, David Graham, hi David. David wrote a hugely wonderful review, as well as Allison Townsend, hi Allison. Rexroth also did a sequel book of translations, Love and the Turning Year, 100 more poems from the Chinese. Are you planning to adapt some of these poems? Perhaps, perhaps not. I keep moving around, finding new things that interest me. I once thought I would be reading or writing conquistador narratives forever. And that stopped after a couple of books. So there's always something moving, but it's always an interest in history or place or a text that seems so evocative. Is there a particular edition of the Rexroth 100 poems you recommended? There are several, but the one I found was Kenneth Rexroth. There are other translations. Why don't we close, since I think Daniel may be wondering how long are we going? I'll read one more. This is I crossed the Fox River on the way to Whitewater and back home to Milwaukee every day for 30 years. On the vernal equinox, with snow showers expected, Mi Yao Chin remembers, I remember the river at Wusong. I don't have to remember how I drive every day the same way back and forth across the Kettle Moraine. Every year the fox hardens, then widens across spring fields. Some days I slow down, watch flocks ascend. Sometimes the moon rises in my windshield. Cranes fly so close, I smile. In the fall, dead deer stain the roads. Most of the time, I wonder about you. All right. Now let's all retreat to the bars. Daniel, any closing thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank both of you for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Sylvia Cavanaugh. What a wonderful conversation. DeWitt Clinton's book is available for sale at Boswell. So thank you all in the audience for coming. We wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you.
We want to thank Sylvia for keeping me in line.
And thank you, Boswell, for hosting this. And thank you, DeWitt, for your very inspiring collection of poems.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to see you all. I feel like I want to give you an elbow hug or something.
All right. Good night, everybody.
If you purchase one of the books, then you can get a signature.
That's right. Ha!
Good night, everyone.
Right.
Good night.